Okay, well, I hope you've managed to get yourself some popcorn. I'm going to talk now about the second two numbers, 1 and 2. So firstly, I want to talk about big questions, and I would recommend that you have a look at Rachel's work here. It's a fairly short article in Teaching Geography from 2011. It's referenced actually behind the next slide rather than this one. But as I've argued in the first part, the Anthropocene can be considered as a way of bringing all of the bits of the subject together, encouraging people to ask big questions and therefore developing geographical thinking. And I'm not sure why that slide hasn't gone forward. There we go. So here's a quote from Rachel's article. To make the discipline of geography accessible to school students, teachers have to make decisions about how to organise the content, which topics to teach, when, at which scale, with which geographical links, resources and teaching approaches all the time. Teaching global locations, topicality, diversity and local environments also contribute to any curriculum design in geography. Add to this the plethora of case studies, and this is the important thing, the content of even the best planned curriculum can start to seem random to many students, okay? So how do teachers condense and make sense of the world in all its dimensions and provide an accessible, beg your pardon, lost my throat here, accessible subject for their students? We need a means by which to provide coherence and help students to navigate their way through a meaningful rather than a random curriculum. And going back, even the best planned curriculum could start to seem random. That's the thinking that leads to would-be trainee geography teachers listing their modules rather than defining the subject. So she provides a series of possible questions, big questions. Why do people live where they do? Why do weather and climate vary from place to place? And so on. Why do people have such different lifestyles? If you think about it, those are huge questions, but it encourages kids to ask lots of smaller questions and delve into all sorts of different areas of geography. So you're encouraging them to think geographically and to become geographers. So I want to illustrate that with a series of photos connected to a particular question. What is a coast? Now, what would happen normally in a lecture like this? I would say 1 minute in pairs, have a chat, see what you come up with. And then you've come up with an answer. And I would guess that at this point, as you're thinking, you've come up with an answer that's based around physical geography because of the nature of the photo in front of you. What about when I put this picture up? How does that then modify your answer to the previous photo? And again, in a lecture theatre, I give you 30 seconds to have a think about that, because we've now got a few people involved. And indeed, what about that photo? So just to go back through, this is not how I would do it in a real lecture. We've got the physical geography, we've got some tourism geographies, we've got a mixture of marine, fishing, whatever type geographies. Some of you will recognize those places. Those 3 photos were all taken on the same walk. That one is Whitby, and the previous one was Brunswick Bay, and then the first one was between Staithes and Brunswick Bay, if I remember rightly. So different answers according to the stimuli, but they're basically the same question. What is a coast? Let's take that one step further. How natural is the coast? You could argue, on the basis of that particular picture, that the coast looks fairly natural if you ignore the sort of the land use, the human impacts there. That one, again, between Brunswick Bay and Sands End. However, when you look at a different bit, and that's Sands End itself, then you can see that humans have clearly decided that some parts of the coast, some parts of the coast need protection. And others, there's the entrance to Whitby Harbour, need additions. Okay, so What you've got in those 6 photos, all taken on the same walk, 2 big questions: what is a coast and how natural is the coast, is an opportunity to draw in a whole load of geographical thinking to come up with a rather more complete answer in relation to what coastal geographies are. And on this, Rachel quoting Margaret Roberts at this point, big geographical questions root geography in the principles of inquiry and provide a purpose to learning which concepts in isolation might not. And they also reinforce the significance of students as autonomous inquirers, encouraging the kids to ask big questions. And big geographical questions are the sort of questions they transcend individual topics and can be responded to at many levels. When I'm doing this with my students, I often give them that map. It's a map of the impacts, the projected impacts of climate change under business as usual for the end of this century. But instead of saying to them, okay, so where's going to be hit worse, where's going to benefit, blah, 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 ask, what big questions do you want to ask of the map? Incidentally, behind this slide, there's a whole load of notes from and a reference to the report that this particular map came from. But the important point here is not to say, yeah, Florida's going to get hammered and the northern US is going to do okay. It's actually to get them to think about what they want to ask of the map. What is it that intrigues them? Some of you who've, if you've read some of my stuff will know that I kind of like mysteries. I think mysteries do exactly that sort of thing. So there was one that I did, teaching geography, spring 2015, about the connection between Marie Antoinette and Heathrow Airport, at which there's usually a kind of mildly bewildered, you what? I don't need to go into the whole story, but basically Marie Antoinette allegedly said, let them eat cakes. Famines was a trigger for the French Revolution. Famine was caused by harvest failure, caused by a volcanic eruption, a massive volcanic eruption on Iceland, Laki, in 1783, I think, in the notes, it's not. Heathrow Airport, the planes were grounded when Unify erupted in 2011. What's the connection? That is big geographical thinking to try and make, and you wouldn't expect children to know that. If you look at the article, there are series, it's a card sort, and all the clues are in there for them to make that sort of connection. Here's another one. What's the connection between Native Americans, Christopher Columbus, and frost fairs on the Thames? And the answer to this one, in 1610, there was a short-lived but pronounced dip in atmospheric carbon dioxide, which had been captured in the Antarctic ice core. This is called the Orbis spike, and it marks when the Columbian exchange, I'll come back into that in a moment, can be seen in geological sediments. The drop occurred because Europeans carrying smallpox and other diseases to the Americas for the first time led to the deaths of more than 50 million people in a few decades. There was a complete collapse of pre-Columbian, as in Christopher Columbus, American society, because populations were wiped out. As a result of the population being wiped out, there was extensive regrowth of forest, which sucked out enough carbon dioxide to temporarily cool the planet. This was indeed the last globally cool moment before the onset of the long-term warmth of the Anthropocene. Okay, so what's the connection? Chappie on the left there got smallpox as a result of Chappie in the middle and his mates arriving, all of which triggered a cooler climate for a period. And the result of that was you had ice on the Thames and frost fairs. There's a bit more to it than that. But you can see these are big geographical questions and making useful links. In relation to that Columbian exchange, we can also talk about how species have become globalized. So that when you look at what was originally in one place and is now much more global in its distribution, then you can again see Are we talking about biomes? Are we talking about anthrones? To put that in some kind of context, in Europe, there were no potatoes or tomatoes before the 16th century. In the Americas, no wheat or bananas, no chili peppers in China or India, and no peanuts in Africa. Just try imagining a world where Peru is the only country that produces potatoes, and the harvesting of wheat is restricted to Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Unthinkable in modern terms, but an impact of, a consequence of the impact of humans on the planet. Moving on then to the final chunk that I was going to talk about, futures and so on. The concept of the Anthropocene is essentially forward-looking. Humanity is having a massive impact. We need to be aware of it, and where necessary, to do something about it, which can again lead us into big geographical questions. So what, for instance, would an entirely flood-proof city look like? And there's an interesting article there that I've referenced. The actual photo is not from a city at all, a town near where I live in Lancashire. Equally, we can ask questions about the impacts of changing human geographies. So that's Billingham in the 1940s. How did we get from that to that 20 years later, to that in 1970? It certainly doesn't look like that today. Any of you have had the delights of being at the junction between the M62 and the M1. To that, there's the historical sequence in terms of transport change. And then, of course, where are we going next? One thing in the current situation as well that might be a useful case study might be the future of the high street, given how many issues there are at the moment in relation to retail, asking big geographical questions. And how does the concept of the Anthropocene help us to understand the implications for the planet of a post-carbon future? All three of the previous big questions, climate change, flood-proofing, changing levels of mobility, could lead onto a very big question with a clear indication of the relevance of geography. Now, these questions relate closely to the work of David Hicks. And he uses the idea of a future frame, where you have the current situation and then you present to your pupils and ask them what would be their preferred future scenario and what they think is the most likely one. And the kind of big questions that you can ask in relation to this: what effect is humanity having on ... How should things be changed in the future? What are the potential consequences of carrying on as usual? And one of the things that I really like about David Hicks's framework there is that by having that preferred in, and not simply the probable one, it can give children a sense of agency. And it can be taken further. I mean, I've seen it done where pupils may be asked about things like future planning scenarios in their local area. And you can take that further by engaging them with the planning officers, who often look at things through a rather more middle-aged, grown-up lens, and perhaps sometimes should listen to the teenagers about what they want in their own local environment. So I would encourage you to think in those terms, because the one thing we don't want to do as geographers is to present the subject as simply some kind of doom and gloom, we're all going to hell in a handcart, because that will put the kids off. Would you want to do a subject where every time you turned up, the teacher was just saying, the world's going to the dogs, etc., etc.? We need to be able to get them to think geographically, to think about the world as a whole, but also to think positively about the world. And I think on that point, I'll come to a conclusion. So, can we use the Anthropocene proposal as a way to more consciously shape a better future for the age of humans? And indeed, can we create a good Anthropocene in which both humans and nature might thrive together into the deep future. One of the interesting things about the current situation that we're in is the way in which pollution levels have dropped. And some people, not all by any means, are starting to say, should we go back to where we were before lockdown? And these kind of questions are really very important. So I will leave you at that point with a little bit of light reading to keep you going over the weekend. Thank you for listening. I suppose if you've not listened, you've switched off and gone home, because you can do that with any lecture. I will pause it there.